and the judges may introduce themselves. Off to you.
Okay, my name is Susan Firestone, and I'm a retired patent attorney, and I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We had about 8 inches of snow.
I'm Tim Moore from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin.
My name is Lester Brooks. I'm in the History Department at Anne Arundel Community College in Arnold, Maryland. Hey, Mrs. Vaychik and everybody else, how you doing?
And if the team could introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Anna Mooney. I'm a senior at Boonsboro High School, and after I graduate, I will be attending Stevenson University to pursue a degree in business communications.
Hi, my name is Morgan Tyler. I will be graduating in 2022 from Boonsboro High School. My plan is to attend a 2-year college where I will earn my associates and transfer into an ROTC program where I will finish my master's.
Hi, my name is Connor Youngman, and I'm a 2021 graduate from Boonsboro High School, and I plan on attending Salisbury University for a degree in business management and real estate. And this is our teacher, Mrs. Vasic.
Yeah. We have question 1 today. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? And you may begin.
In the early stages of the convention, the debate centered around 3 large areas of disagreement: government structure, representation, and slavery.
At the convention, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists had different opinions on how the government should be run. The Federalists wanted a clear separation between the national and state governments, with the national government holding the majority of the power.
The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were fearful of a tyrannical national government and advocated against separation of powers, claiming private views and self-interest are almost always mixed in the works of public welfare.
In regards to representation, it came down to an issue of state population. The Virginia plan proposed the legislative branch be determined by the population of the state. The New Jersey plan proposed that each state shall get 1 representative regardless of population.
The Connecticut Compromise solved this dispute by saying that the national government would have a bicameral legislature, with 1 house being determined by population and 1 house having equal representation regardless of population.
However, another issue arose when the southern states wanted enslaved people to count towards a representation, but not for taxation. The framers determined that an enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a freedman for the purposes of taxation and representation.
Although some major disagreements at the convention had come to resolution, many other issues had only been slightly discussed, if not at all. Some of those issues include slavery, the lack of voting rights in terms of the national level, and women's rights.
Slavery was brought up during the Constitutional Convention for the purposes of representation and taxation within the states. However, the abolition and resolution of the issue was not resolved. The abolition of slavery was dependent on the state following the convention until 1865 when the 13th Amendment abolished it.
The issue around voting rights in terms of the national level was also not resolved at the convention. Voting rights were mandated at state levels even for primary elections, but the number of years it took for all minorities to earn the right to vote in their states was due to the consequences of this non-existent discussion.
Until 1870, when the 15th Amendment was passed, only white males could vote, and the amendment prohibited states to deny a black male the right. Southern states also consciously used poll taxes and literacy tests to turn away African Americans from voting.
Almost 200 years after the convention in 1965, President Johnson outlawed the use of discriminatory voting practices used by states with the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
Women could also not vote until the 19th Amendment that was ratified in 1920, about 150 years after the convention.
At the beginning of the 21st century, basic constitutional principles are under stress from technological advances unimaginable even a few decades ago, let alone in the founding era.
In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act after the case of Shelby v. Holder, stripping the Justice Department of powers it held for decades in curbing racial discrimination in voting.
Establishing an explicit right to vote in the Constitution would guarantee the rights of every citizen of voting age, ensure that every vote is counted correctly, and defend against attempts to effectively disenfranchise voters. This would also empower Congress to enact minimum electoral standards to guarantee a higher form of legitimacy while giving our courts the authority to keep politicians in check when they attempt to game the vote for partisan reasons.
Removing unreasonable from the 4th Amendment will make it clear that any and all searches or seizures of persons, property, papers, houses, and effects must require a lawful warrant.
This would eliminate such legal precedent as Terry v. Ohio, which allows the search of a person who has been temporarily detained so long as an officer has reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Rather than continue to challenge such precedent in court, we should eliminate it altogether.
Through decades of party politics and a misunderstanding of the executive, the powers of the presidency have continually expanded.
By making the separation of powers a matter of law rather than just an ideal, the long-standing precedent of the imperial president and effectless Congress can be eliminated entirely. It is no longer enough for separation of powers to live within the text of the Constitution. It must be an explicit law.
The Equal Rights Amendment gained traction recently, seeking to end the legal distinctions between men and women in matters of divorce, property, employment, and other matters, as well as all people, regardless of age, ethnicity, or hierarchy, having the right to healthcare are two other amendments that are topics of discussion in the present day. Thank you for listening to our testimony. We are now ready for your questions.
Hey, Tim?
Yeah, I guess I would lead out with the convention itself. I happen to think that the delegates at the convention are really, really naughty in the sense that they wrote a whole new constitution. Should we admire these delegates for not doing what they were supposed to do?
At the time of the convention, in order to have the convention, in order to abolish the the Articles of Confederation, or even amend them at all, you had to have all of the colonies there. Rhode Island was not present for the convention, so by that logic, we shouldn't praise the framers for creating a new constitution since they went against the works of the Articles of Confederation.
Going off of what my colleague Anna said, although I agree with her, an opposing viewpoint is that the Articles of Confederation were showing that they were not working in a growing nation like the United States was. So their biggest issues were to create a new constitution for a growing nation, and that's ultimately what they did. So although I agree with my colleague Anna, that was an opposing view.
While I agree with both my colleagues, going off of what my colleague Morgan said, it was pretty clear and obvious that the Articles of Confederation were a failure at itself, and we needed, historical demigods such as, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison to create a strong government that would withstand for years to come.
Let me ask this question about the controversy over slavery, which you touched on quite a bit. Why not just resolve it then and there? And had they resolved the issue right then and there, we would have had less trouble generations after.
There were pushes at the convention from advocates like George Mason, who was a prominent figure who advocated for the end of the slave trade, and also Patrick Henry, who was an abolitionist. So there were the anti-federalist voices to end slavery at the convention. However, I think when it came to the point of ratifying the convention, the Federalists knew that they were going to get passed, and so all of the anti-federalists attempted to get as much legislation as they could that voiced their opinion, and slavery unfortunately fell off that.
Yeah, going off of what my colleague Anna said, slavery was, discussed at the convention and was, expressed highly by some anti-federalists such as Patrick Henry. But, at the convention, their voice was, somewhat eliminated by the amount of federalists at the convention. And, it was pretty clear that, at the convention, the priority was enacting a strong national government, like I said, that would stand for years to come. And slavery wasn't exactly the priority at the time, even though the Three-Fifths Compromise was enacted.
And it also did lead to issues after the convention, like the Missouri Compromise, where they couldn't decide if Missouri should be a slaveholding state or a non-slaveholding state. And it also led to African-American males not being able to vote until 150 years after the convention. So it did lead to issues after.
Although it wasn't directly resolved, there were some motions to help limit its consequences, specifically what's referred to as the slave trade clause, which put the congressional hold for ending the slave trade in 1808, which was as soon as it was ready. That's when, under Thomas Jefferson, the slave trade officially did end.
You mentioned that you thought that, in your opinion, that the powers of the presidency have increased greatly, and that you have an amendment, I believe, that separation of powers, make that explicit. How would you go about doing that? I mean, what would you do to make that explicit?
So,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
If we wanted to make separation of powers more explicit, I think we'd have to limit how much executive control has, because after FDR, with the creation of the numerous government agencies as a way to curb the trend of the Great Depression, the powers of the presidency have expanded drastically. And so if we put a limit on how much the president can do and it can be checked by the judicial branch, then it would all overall create an enhanced separation of powers.
Going off what said is, one of the things that we could limit, powers of the executive is limiting the number of executive orders that are written, as that's, kind of become, a big thing granted to the executive branch in recent years.
An example of what both of my colleagues were saying was Donald Trump's presidency, where he had written hundreds of executive orders by the end of his term.
Let me ask about the 15th Amendment. Again, as I asked with the Constitution, here there was an easy way to solve voting. Just say all citizens could vote. Why not do it that way?
The drafters of the Constitution, specifically Hamilton and Madison, were unfortunately very elitist, and they thought that the only people that should be able to vote are the white educated man. And they also thought that, at the time of the convention, it was only landowning men that could vote. So it also inhibited poorer class citizens from voting, as well as disenfranchising African Americans and women. So there were a lot of issues, and they just originally intended it to be an elitist system.
And going off of what my colleague Anna said, a reason with women not being able to vote is because they thought that if women were to vote in a household, it would just reflect the vote of their husband in the household. So they were like, well, why would we let the women vote when it's just going to be 2 votes for one candidate when it should just be 1?
Yeah, and I, agree that there should be a voting rights amendment, making it explicit that every citizen should have the right to vote, and that we should not, continue to allow states to pass legislation that are essentially disenfranchising voters, such as we've seen, very recently in Georgia, and, after 2013 in Shelby v. Holder, where states such as Texas and North Carolina, immediately enacted bills and laws, looking to, essentially limit the voice of the citizens in their states.
Hey, was secrecy a good idea at the convention?
It's hard to say, but I think it ended up being well because there was no outside pressure from any of the normal citizens to put on the delegates and trying to intimidate them to force legislation into the new Constitution.
I agree with my colleague Anna, and something that's like that today is in the judicial branch, where there's really no outside voices to sway the judges one way or the other, which makes for a fair trial. And I think that same concept applied at the Constitution. There was no outside voices and pressure. So it made for a fair sit down, a sit down of the Constitution.
Yeah, and I agree with both my colleagues. And I think that, not having outside voices and outside knowledge within the Constitutional Convention really promoted the promotion of civil discourse, to where talks of discussion could be executed thoroughly without, outside knowledge.
An opposing viewpoint, however, would be they were drafting a constitution that would overall affect all of the citizens of our nation. So excluding citizens from that discussion would basically limit their voices, and therefore they couldn't really have any say. And it was just these elected officials that would represent their voices without them giving any hope.
Thank you very much. The time is up. Now we have some follow-up for you. So if Lester, do you want to start?
Okay. You hit a number of issues in your opening statement, as I expected. The controversies such as representation and slavery, and you hit slavery hard. You talked about the Virginia and New Jersey plan, and you were clear on that, and the presentation of a bicameral legislature. So you were hitting the steps. Follow-ups, I thought were, again, you brought out some evidence. You brought out some of the historical evidence. For example, the stripping of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, a very current issue that we're wrestling with, and that whole voting issue. And you were hitting some issues there. I liked your response with the idea of an executive or the whole idea of slavery. Should it be compromised at the time? And I liked your response there. Your talk of George Mason and Patrick Henry, again, it seemed like you were right on the nose. I like the idea that you were agreeing with each other, and that showed that, you know, there was some thinking going on there. So again, as usual, good job.
And there were a couple of really nice things you did. First of all, I really appreciated your first sentence. Here's our thesis statement, and here's 3 things we're going to tell you about. Thank you. You didn't make me search for what you were going to be saying. You told me exactly. Structure, representation, and slavery, dopey. Here's what we're going to talk about. Thank you. No, I'm serious about that. It really is helpful because we see a lot of these, and to have a clear explanation. So structurally, your argument, I really appreciated that first sentence straight out of the chute. A lot of evidence. I think it's interesting that that your use of history, historical evidence was quite good. This isn't major, but it's interesting. Your state is one of the few states that wrote the instructions to their delegates going to the convention a little more open-ended, well, maybe a lot more open-ended than other states. Other states said revise the articles. Your state didn't say that. They said it a little more open. In other words, maybe Maryland was onto something here, that go and rewrite a whole new system. So I might urge you to look at the Maryland instructions as opposed to other states' instructions to their delegates. But that's a real minor quibble that I have. But you know, your references of how the sins of the convention continued on, and maybe all the way to 1964. I thought your use of history was quite good, and a full-throated defense of the slavery, or excuse me, of the secrecy clause. I think a lot of people look at that as a terrible thing, but at the time, very few people thought it was a bad idea. Now, afterwards, the anti-federalists went nuts over it, but so I appreciated your understanding of that. So thank you. I enjoyed spending this time with you.
I did too, and I also appreciate structure, and it's kind of interesting. You mentioned the government structure, and then you structured your own talk. I think that was probably inadvertent, but you did that, and then you
Right.
told us what you, and then you did say it and follow it, which is always good too, because I've had people over the years not follow their own structure. I liked the response on the women's votes a lot, especially because the fear that women would just vote the way their husbands told them to vote if they were married. So that was an actual argument that people took seriously. I like to have had more time to I was curious about the text stresses that we have now and how they have an effect on our constitutionality in our Constitution. But we didn't have time, unfortunately, because we only have 8 minutes. But I did like you mentioned some of the changes, adding into the Constitution some minimal standards for search and seizure that we don't have right now. I mean, I guess you could say they're minimal because they're almost non-existent. So that I thought that was nicely done. And other things that you have, which tells me that you reading and studying and you have been thinking about these issues. So I enjoyed your presentation. So good job. Another